Arline Geraniums, welcome to the podcast, More Health, Less Healthcare. I've been looking forward to talking with you for a couple of years since I first read your book.
Thank you.
And I want to not just focus on the title, let me hold the book up for everybody looking at this. The title is pretty obvious, but what's just as important is the subtitle, The Extraordinary Stress of Ordinary Life in an Unjust Society, which kind of sums it up. Um, but I think most people get the idea of that, stress and the effect it has on our day-to-day life and on our health. But what you really point out, which I think is really important, is that systemic injustice takes a physical toll on specific people, regardless of their own health habits, even their genetic predisposition. I don't think most people get that. So
Mhm.
let's unpack it and level set our discussion by going with what's your working definition of weathering, and who does it impact the most,
Mhm.
and why is it such a corrosive process?
Mhm. Okay. Um, well, weathering is what happens to people's bodies when they're subjected to chronic, unrelenting stress. And that stress comes from a variety of sources, but in particular, um, it comes from some of the ideologies, some of the laws, the rules, and just the circumstances of life that are different for groups of people who in our society or in a different society, those groups of people who are marginalized by that society, who have fewer opportunities, greater constraints, maybe fewer resources, but also who have been kind of profiled or even maligned or racialized as being members of a population based on their nationality, religion, or skin color, for example, um, uh, that has become one of the vectors of how we divide our society. And it works through biological processes that any human who is subjected to that degree of marginalization or stressors or environmental toxins, even. So it can be material hardships, it can be environmental toxins, but it can also be the various isms, racism, sexism, xenophobia, the ways in which you have fewer uh, chances and privileges because you were born into. It's kind of an accident of birth that you were born
Right.
into a group that our broader society or dominant culture thinks of as, in some sense, less than.
We'll get into the physiology in just a second, but let's roll it back a bit. I was very
Mhm.
curious how you became aware of this phenomenon called weathering. And from what I gather in some of your other interviews, it started way back in college.
Yes.
So tell us, how did you become first aware of it? And then what were the steps that brought you to this book? By the way, people should know that you're a professor at School of Public Health in Michigan, but you're also honored by the National Academy of Medicine, part of the National Academy of Sciences, for your discovery of weathering.
Right.
So how did it begin?
It began, I mean, there's two versions of this story, but the one that's clearest to me, the other version I adopted as I wrote the book, which is, I'll just say that one because it's easier quickly. I came to realize that the reason I probably was drawn to weathering is that I had seen in my parents and grandparents my grandparents were immigrants who had been persecuted in their home country and then not treated so well here. And my parents had grown up in very working class uh, communities. And so I sort of had this spark while I was writing that the reason I got drawn to this is because I actually had seen it all around me. I having grown up the next generation, not as subjected to the same kind of stressors or lack of resources or lack of opportunities, didn't think I identified with this process of weathering, but I think through my parents I did. But the more typical story I will tell, and that I think I even mentioned in the book, or you may have heard on other interviews, is that when I was in college, I had at the same time two jobs. Well, I actually had four or five jobs, but two jobs that led to where I am today. One of them was I was a research assistant for a professor in the Office of Population Research at my school, um, who hired me to read about teenage pregnancy. He was writing for Science magazine or uh, a sort of literature review about teenage pregnancy, which was a term that was very new. This is the 70s. This is sort of the early to mid 70s. And there really, even though of course there had been teen mothers or people who had children as teenagers since time immemorial, this sort of construct that there was a social group called teen mothers, and they were not ready for childbearing, and they were having children too young and by accident, and it was just ruining their lives, their children's lives, and eventually society's lives as their children became, antisocial or even criminal because they hadn't been raised by mature people. At that same time that I was looking up the kind of so-called literature on that new concept, I also taught at a school for teenage mothers. And so for me, the kind of defining or the push that put me on the path that got me here today was that what the literature and the professor I was working for, and most anybody who was educated and middle or upper class believed at the time, what they seemed to think was true of teen mothers didn't fit at all with what I saw with real teen mothers. And I was very curious about that. Um, uh, and also what well-meaning, well-intentioned people in the academy and in advocacy organizations and government thought would be the solutions to the problems associated with teen childbearing, I could see weren't going to make a difference. So it was both things. They don't seem to understand what's really going on. This new category of person they've concocted called the teen mother doesn't really exist. And yet I was also seeing through my job at the school, alternative school for teen moms, because at that point, when you got pregnant, you were certainly in their school district, you weren't allowed to go to school. So this was a school that was built just for them. Um, I saw that while they themselves didn't seem to think their pregnancies were problematic, some of them were actually planned. Others of them were greeted as nice surprises, even if they weren't planned. Um, and everybody was excited, looking forward to becoming a mother. But what I did see was that they had a lot of health problems that my college classmates and I, who were roughly the same age, just didn't experience. Uh, and so I was thinking both, well, why are we demonizing this group of people and miscategorizing them completely uh, and believing we can solve all their hardships if we could just get them not to have babies till they're 20, which is kind of a magical idea when you think about it, but not caring about these health issues. I'd get a cold when a virus was running around on campus or even in the general geographic area, and some of them would get the same cold, maybe even from me. I hope not, but and I'd be better in 5 days. You know, they would end up, with bronchitis and chronic bronchitis, and then asthma, and they would be put on drugs to deal with the bronchitis. And they would be sick for months, and sometimes with scars or chronic illnesses that just lasted the rest of their lives. And so I was just really struck. Something's happening to their health. Nobody seems to notice that. They just notice if they're having a baby. And I went to graduate school to try to understand the disconnect, why we thought teenage pregnancy was such a universally horrible thing. Obviously, I would have been thrown out of the house if I became a teen mother. So I had been raised to believe, and I probably would have lost a lot of opportunities I've had if I had become pregnant before I went to college, for example. But that isn't universally true. And what's also not universally true is that you're healthy enough to postpone childbearing to later ages.
Right, right.
Um,
One of your research findings was that there's a mythology as to what is the correct age, the most beneficial age for moms to become pregnant and give birth. And I think one of your conclusions was, and this is rooted in a fair amount of literature now, is that it's not the same for white moms or a black mom or a young mom. That maybe what's an ideal age cohort to think about for pregnancy is not the same for both groups. And in
right.
fact, it may even be actually, what's the right word? You would have to know a lot more about the social cultural aspect of both
Right.
groups to understand that maybe for young black moms, their most healthy childbearing years may be a lot younger than
Mhm.
for a white middle class mom, which is a very, very striking feeling that
Right.
I'm not aware of. A lot of obstetricians and clinicians were aware of that.
Mm-mm.
Tell us more about that.
Yes, that was from my dissertation. So I went to graduate school to try and figure out what was going on and to try to, I think, also call attention or try to see if these health problems that I had seen in this small group of teenagers, which were the teen mothers themselves, but also the school had a clinic that a lot of teens in the area came to whether or not they were pregnant. So I one of my jobs was as their peer companion through their medical exams. Um, I saw these signs of worse health than I was seeing among my college classmates. Um, I wanted to understand, is that really happening? Was it just something about Trenton, New Jersey in this particular, cohort of people, or is that true more generally in the United States or in areas of the United States that were like Trenton, which at that time was a working class, predominantly Black and Puerto Rican place. Um, uh, and so I did my dissertation on the question of um, are are the poor outcomes associated with teen pregnancy due to teen pregnancy, basically. Um, uh, that's everybody constructed it as yes. What
Right.
and whatever that poor outcome was, whether it was a low birth weight or maternal death, or whether it was poverty, subsequent poverty for the family, or the mother and her child. Um, and I started off actually being cautious, I guess, not quite believing myself that we were all wrong to think what was the conventional wisdom, and just thought, well, I sort of treated it like a statistical exercise of, well, the people who become teen mothers are disproportionately poor and minority young women, and the people who become older mothers are disproportionately white and well-educated and affluent women. Um, and that's true to this day. Um, so maybe the poor outcomes we see in teen mothers aren't due to them being teens, but are just due to they're part of a um, uh, poorly resourced, marginalized, socially excluded group. And part of the reason maybe the older mothers are doing better is because they have a lot more resources and they
Right,
tend to be white. And so I had first thought if you could take those different contexts and background factors into account, you wouldn't see the age dimension of, maternal age and birth outcome. And what I found in my dissertation, which is what you're alluding to, was yes, you saw a very distinct age dimension, but it was totally different than the one people thought. The one
right.
people thought did apply pretty well to white Americans, that the teen years were the highest risk ages for whatever, again, whether you're talking about social outcomes, economic outcomes, but I first focused on health outcomes for the mother and baby. Um, but for Black teen mothers, they had the lowest risk ages. It wasn't simply that we were misspecifying the problem as being about age rather than about poverty or racism or these other factors, um, but that they're teen mothers, meaning mothers in their late teens. I want to be clear about that because part of the concept of teenage pregnancy as such a horrible social problem is people talk about babies having babies and they talk about 11-year-olds and 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds. The very vast majority, upwards of something like 85% of all teen births then and now, are to young women 18 or 19 who can vote, who can go to war, who can sign contracts. So this babies having babies had given people a very different idea of what teen moms were like. But when I see that they're not just no more at risk in their teens if they're from a marginalized, oppressed group, but they're actually less likely to be poor, less likely to drop out of high school, less likely to have a low birth weight baby. So, sort of turning everything on its head. Then I needed to know, well, what is going on that makes the risks go up so fast so that even in your 20s, even the early 20s, and certainly by the mid and late 20s, if you're a Black woman, you're at a higher risk of all those poor outcomes than if you were 18 when you had your child. What could be happening to make the risks go up? And if you postpone till the ages we now think are the best age, I've lived long enough to see that we always think there's a best age, but it keeps changing what it is. So now we're thinking the best ages are in the 30s. But if you wait that long, when you're in certain demographics, you'll have rates of poor outcomes that are 6 or more times higher than if you had had the baby in your late teens.
All right, I want to make sure we get into why Black moms are basically twice at risk for dying of childbirth than white moms.
Mhm.
Go back before we get to that.
Mhm.
Walk us through what are if we have a set of factors that are defining a person's risk strategy,
Mhm.
how do those stressors impact physiological various organs?
Mhm.
And that's really the reason for weathering. Walk us through what the impact on bodily physiology is of these kinds of stressors.
Okay. Well, there's multiple stressors, and that's part of it. It needs to be chronic stress and coming from multiple places.
You know,
So we all have stress sometimes, but this constant stress is really something that some populations face much more than others. There may be individuals in any population who, for whatever reason, have these experiences too, but on a population level, meaning Black or white or rural or urban or suburban, there are ways we have structured our society to have to avoid chronic stress for the most part in our more um, higher up populations in our hierarchies and promote chronic stress in other groups. So the reason that matters is that human beings are adapted to deal with very stressful triggers. Um, we're all kind of made to notice if we might not be safe. We're not always right. We can get that wrong. But the example everybody knows is sort of the fight or flight reaction to, say, there's a tiger coming at you. Our body does our sort of cognitive capacities shut down because who has time to think about, well, what shall I do now? And your body, your sort of physiological arousal system takes over, and it has a lot of effects on your body that are all optimized for you to survive that
Right.
threat. And so, but some of those specific threats or processes are, it obviously makes your heart rate go up. It makes your breathing rate go up. It pushes your blood through your blood vessels at a much harder, stronger rate. So your blood pressure. It mobilizes from storage sites in your body fats and immune cells and sugars to kind of keep fueling you and fueling the large muscles so that you can hope to either fight or flee, this lion that's coming at you. Everything becomes dedicated to that. And at the same time, other organs or body systems that aren't going to help you flee or fight the lion get sort of shut down. They stop getting nutrients. Some of them are even cannibalized for proteins to be put into this bloodstream to fuel the fight or flight. And that's, that is your only hope of saving your life. So it's a trade-off worth having, but it's only meant to happen for about 3 minutes. As Robert Sapolsky talks about, there's sort of 3 minutes of terror on the savannah, and then either you're dead or you've escaped, one or the other. And once you've escaped, then all your body processes go down to normal. And he says, this happens in a matter of minutes. So this way our bodies work are sort of adapted to situations where we'll have few life or death, very acute and very short-lived stressors. And in that context, they work very well for us. But what's also true is if that stress arousal does not become deactivated because the stress has passed, the lion is gone, or you've escaped the lion, I think, you're sort of home free, so to speak. Then you stop, you return the immune cells and the fat cells and sugar, down to their storage sites. You stop breathing so hard and pushing your blood circulation so hard. And that 3 minutes where you may have been under that kind of assault in your body doesn't end up having a big effect on your life other than it may have saved it. But if instead that arousal system is activated continuously, and that's what I argue happens in weathering, that for certain groups in our modern society and subject to a variety of realities about our society, some groups actually have that physiological arousal chronically. And so this fat and sugar stays circulating in their blood. We think of that as a way you get high blood pressure or cardiovascular disease or diabetes for that matter. But we think you get that just from what you eat or whether you exercise. But in fact, what weathering shows us is that you also, and starting at a younger age, have fats and sugars and immune cells kind of going aimlessly through your blood vessels and harming them. If you're on that kind of chronic stress trajectory, you're subject to worse birth outcomes if you're pregnant, because of course, if you're pregnant when the lion's coming, you're not going to send nutrients to that fetus. The fetus is a drag on your system. But again, for 3 minutes, the fetus, survives and obviously survives better than if you had been caught by the lion. But if you're just close to 24/7 having nutrients shunted away and diverted away from the fetus in order to feed your large muscles, then your baby is may become
Right.
preterm, low birth weight, etc. Uh,
Let me ask you,
mhm,
what are the examples that you gave it? It's a different example, but I think it's really powerful. You used an example of a meat packing company
mhm,
that was raided, and these weren't young black moms. These are
right.
very, very different socioeconomic mix. And the aftershocks, I thought was absolutely fascinating. Give us a couple minutes of insight. What happened? The meatpacking place gets raided and everybody has to flee. What was the impact in terms of weathering? Very
Uh,
different context.
yes, it was a surprise and highly militarized raid. You'd think they were, fighting a war in Iran the way they went after this one meatpacking plant, and it was the biggest and most militarized such raid to that date, which was I think 2008 or 2009, around there. Um, and so and most of the workers were arrested um, and charged with being, undocumented, even though no one knew whether any given person was undocumented. So you were just kind of profiled. This is an example of a kind of racial profiling. They were primarily from Mexico and Guatemala, um, and so on that basis alone, all the men were arrested. The women who worked there were allowed to go home with ankle chains or ankle monitors. But the men were sent to a cattle congress. They were actually put down cattle chutes. They were just totally humiliated. And then they were arraigned in groups of 10. So no individual got to make his own case. I mean, we talk about what's happening with ICE today. It, some of the similar things were happening just in more isolated in circumstances like this. Um, and so what we found uh, was very fascinating. We had hypothesized that this huge stressor would have major effects on women who were pregnant. And sure enough, women who were either in the raid themselves and pregnant or married to men who were arrested and pregnant had huge increases in preterm births, low birth weight, growth retardation, all the bad outcomes. But what we also found, which I think can only be explained by some aspects of weathering, is that women who are pregnant throughout the state of Iowa, this raid happened in Postville, Iowa, they also in the ensuing year had a 25% increase in all these bad outcomes. And this was true no matter how far they were in Iowa from the raid. It was true whether they were documented or undocumented. It was true whether they were native, many of them were US citizens, but of Mexican descent, or possibly with extended family who were undocumented, I don't know, or first generation immigrants. So it didn't matter. There was an effect that raid had on the health of births in anyone who had the social identity of being of Latin descent. And I think that's a really key insight for weathering, or a key example of weathering, because it tells you that the stress arousal can happen just from someone you identify with having these experiences, or you're worried that because someone you identified with has these experiences, they might come to you. Um, and or because you're profiled as someone who might be worthy of being treated this way. So people also, they stayed out of public space. There were a lot of ways their life got harder, even if they were, native-born American citizens. Um,
Right.
uh, and so through weathering, I understood that both acute insult, but also the chronicity of it, not because they did it over and over, but because it opened up the possibility that you might not be safe anywhere if you were of Latin descent. And so you needed to be vigilant everywhere. What it did was it aroused that same physiological stress arousal, only it did it chronically. And so for pregnant women, that meant that their fetuses were not getting the nutrients they needed. And we also came to think, well, we could show this in the pregnant women, in part because pregnancy is 9 months. So it's sort of, and we could have a clear before and after of when this raid was. If it was affecting the health of anyone who was of Latin descent, then that means it was probably affecting men. It was affecting children. It was affecting everybody. We could see it and measure it in the birth outcomes, but you didn't have to be pregnant to have real suddenly felt the world was not safe for you and you had to remain vigilant. And it is that vigilance, that chronic vigilance, that keeps all those processes I described happening. And over time, you'll get, from the sugars and the fats, you'll get all the things we think of from eating too much, hardening of the arteries, cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure. But you'll also, from the immune cells being sent, in circles endlessly, your immune system gets dysregulated. And so your immune system over time becomes weak. You become more susceptible to infectious disease. You become more susceptible to autoimmune disease because your immune system is also becomes dysregulated because it just goes berserk over time of having to be in this endless loop of being all mobile, sort of all dressed up and nowhere to go.
All right, let me try and conclude on a positive note.
Okay, please.
You know as much as anyone in the country about weathering. It's a societal problem. It affects all of us. Some are worse than others. Whether it be on a policy level or a delivery system level or clinical and practitioner level, what gives you optimism going forward? We know what the issues are. We even know how to solve a lot of them.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I don't know if we have the political will or the courage to address these, especially disparities in maternal health. What gives you optimism that given where we are today, given what we know, and you wonderfully laid out in explicit detail what the issues are, what the problems are, and really what some solutions are, what gives you optimism going forward?
Well, there are a few things. So I do think it's a process at best of, two steps forward, one step back. And I think we're currently in a world in this country that's more like the one step back. But there are several things that give me hope. One is that I'd like to think if people read the book or learned about weathering one way or another, they would start seeing the health problems they sincerely, there's a lot of good people who want to solve these health problems. There are plenty of people who don't, but there's many, many, as I said, well-meaning, good intentions, committed people, but they've misunderstood what the causes of these problems are, and therefore they can't possibly come up with solutions. So one thing that gives me hope is I think weathering gives a broader group of people, having written it in a more publicly accessible way than the journal articles I've been writing for 40 years. Um, uh, it gives them a lens to look through to say, well, what if the real problem is X because of what, now that I see things through a weathering lens, now I can think of what could address that. And now I can see why preventing teen childbearing didn't do that. I mean, I talk in the book about how because of this big policy goal to do that, rates of teen childbearing went down 75%. At the same time, rates of poor birth outcomes, low birth weight, very low birth weight, maternal death went up. So we
Yeah.
had seen this as that would be a solution. But I think if you look through a weathering lens, you start seeing why the solutions that seem to make common sense to us, but haven't taken account of what's the real everyday lives of people who are marginalized or impoverished or exploited or overworked, or subjected to ICE or immigration raids. Um, we can start seeing what are maybe more promising alternatives. And I write about that also in the book and give a few suggestions. So, my goal was not to come up with all the solutions. I wanted this to get out to a broad array of readers who could both start to think of the solutions and for there to then be political will on a larger scale for doing those kinds of solutions instead of just caricaturing them as they have been as uh, woke or too progressive or just a matter of teaching people what are the good foods to eat or telling them to get exercise, or just a matter of having more accessible health care. I'm not suggesting these aren't important, and they're sort of part of what may not cause weathering, but translates weathering into early death for a lot of people, is certainly lack of access to health care. Um, but but there's so much more fundamental and coming from so many different directions and in virtually every setting a person of color finds themselves in the United States, and they don't go away just by succeeding economically or educationally. uh,
Well, I take that as the more we know, the more we have an opportunity maybe to choose the right course of action in a comprehensive way. Now, I want to thank you that the scholarship in the book and the lens of which you brought to healthcare and society in general is a major, major step forward. I tend to use an equity lens when I look at healthcare and pluses and minuses, but I've certainly added a weathering lens as well. But I want to thank you. This is just path-breaking work. I'm deeply grateful to you and your scholarship. I look forward to your next set of research and even your journal articles. But Ranger, on this, thank you for sharing your wisdom on this and your research. It's a major, major contribution to the field.
well,
I
thank
thank,
you very much. Thank
I
you.
thank you very much, and just a terrific book.
Thank you.
Take care.
You too.